And so that kind of concludes the paper on the recommendations for the use of the Veggiemeter in the research setting. And so now I want to share just very briefly some ongoing research here at UC Davis that I am involved with. The first, this is the paper I mentioned earlier today, just kind of a brief insight into some of our findings. This is a validation paper where we are validating Diet ID. Diet ID is a novel dietary assessment tool that uses a picture-based algorithm to identify eating behaviors over time. It's really exciting. It essentially shows the participant two variety of food images, and they select the image that most closely reflects the foods that they consume on a daily basis. Using a diet quality photo navigation algorithm, it will then continue to narrow down an individual's dietary choices to reflect the most prominent or similar foods that are consumed on a day-to-day. And so we not only validated this device against NDSR dietary recalls, but we also used the objective measure of the Veggiemeter. And so excitingly, the Veggiemeter correlated both to total carotenoid intake provided by Diet ID, as well as beta carotene in particular. So we looked specifically at beta carotene, as the Veggiemeter is most sensitive to detecting beta carotene in the skin based on the wavelength of the light. And so we did see controlling for BMI in both of these, that both of them were significant findings. And then excitingly, I have a study that will be starting up in just a few weeks that looks at the health implications of food insecurity. And we're doing this through a variety of different measurements, one, of course, being the Veggiemeter. And so this study will be looking at 150 college students, ideally a diverse population of college students. And we're looking at the usage of the on-campus food access resources that we have here at UC Davis. So looking at the frequency of use, as well as what sorts of items they are taking from our local food pantry and food banks, and then collecting blood samples, skin carotenoid scores, anthropometric measures, as well as food security status, nutrition knowledge, and dietary patterns using Diet ID again, to see if the usage of these on-campus food access resources show improvements in subjective and objective measures of dietary intake over the academic term. So really exciting. Hopefully I'll have some data to share with you all when we meet again from this study. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for your time and allowing me to share a little bit about the recommendations paper with you all.
Thank you so much, Marcela, for sharing. I'll just share some of the chat. Virginia commented about how BMI may be a confounder in some age groups, but not others, as in their preschool age groups, they have not found that to be significant. And they'll also be looking at Veggiemeter and food insecurity status in preschool children. So that's exciting that we're all headed that direction.
Yeah, so we didn't look specifically at age. We had a relatively small age range since most of them were college students between the ages of 19 and 24 for the most part. So I don't think our range was necessarily large enough to see some of those impacts that age may bring, such as, increased inflammatory markers. We often see that those can impact skin carotenoid scores. So we didn't see that age played a role in our sample size or sample age group, I guess. But definitely when expanding to larger populations, I think that age can definitely impact skin carotenoid scores.
Yeah, it was more in reference to our recommendation in the paper, because you make a recommendation about we need to explore these other variables, and we do, and then we need to think about how those differ too across age. Because looking at those, like even Stephanie is looking at a number of those in her current study, I think she can confirm that, but with adults. And so then some of those may play out differently when you shift to adolescents or when you shift to infants.
And yeah, this was a huge question in regards to the histogram as an output for the Veggiemeter. So for example, with Rachel and I, our Veggiemeter was used in children a good amount before we shifted more toward the adult population. And so if the histogram is generated based on the population that the device is being used in initially, what happens when you switch to a different population and that histogram is no longer representative of the age group? And if you're using that histogram as the data interpretation for your study, that could look completely different, being that skin carotenoid scores in children are often far lower than that of adults.
Yeah. Random thought, because as you're talking, it made me think of another sort of hot button issue that has come up in different circles, but the idea of, can we even compare scores? And I guess this goes back to the inter-rater reliability or inter-device issue. When we're doing like a histogram type thing, if I'm measuring children with my device here, how comparable does that end up being? We don't know the answer to this question. It's kind of a, broad level question, but how comparable is that to yours in California, for example? Are you going to get the same measure if I use my device with your children? Does anyone have any insight into that, or has anyone looked at that on the call? Because that is what's being pushed in the literature right now, right? Like, we're all being asked like to compare to other studies, and I mean, that's what you do naturally anyways, right?
I have a comment about that, and we really dealt with kind of the sun exposure piece as an interesting concept. So, and Stephanie, I think this goes back to kind of the skin color concept as well. In California, if we're measuring skin carotenoid scores in the summer versus in North Carolina in the winter, that itself too, right, can play a major role when UV exposure and light exposure can really impact skin carotenoid scores too. So not just devices, but like geographical differences in time of year as well, not necessarily on the foods being consumed, but on sun exposure, on other qualities or individual level characteristics.
Or environmental pollutants. So like, should we be collecting zip codes so that we can look at environmental pollutant data at some point? I don't know how important or how impactful these numbers are, but these might be areas for large scale collaboration amongst many people with Veggie meters across different locations.